I've been muted. Hopefully now you can hear. Self-muting myself. But hopefully this will finish up the second part of our close reading of Ralph Ellison's Little Man Station. And yeah, the first part will be on YouTube, I think. So I have a YouTube channel also called Frederick Prof. And I'll make a series of these, and once there's enough of them, called Close Readings. This will be videos where we're looking at a specific reading. I read it aloud. My mouse hovers over the section that we're on. So you can read along with it too, skip around in the video, find the sections where you're kind of interested. And of course, because I'm doing it live on Twitch, sometimes I'm also talking about other things because people in the chat love to, but whatever they want to talk about. So, a little bit messy. It's a little bit experimental. Trying something. That's those videos. The close readings will be about, these longer texts that are helpful in understanding various concepts of rhetoric. So hopefully, you find these helpful or interesting, whether you're in one of these classes or not. And if you come on them, you can leave comment on YouTube if you're coming to this from YouTube, and I will see that and I can respond to it if you have questions. Or if you are watching this live on Twitch, you can leave something in the chat. Or you can come into the Discord and talk directly if you're not there, and we can have a conversation about the Discord. I'll drop the link for the Discord again into the chat so that you are looking for that. You can also see now above me, we have chat live, so that should make it a little bit easier for if you're following along what people are saying. Sometimes I'm responding to that. It'll be clearer because what people are saying will appear above me. So hopefully that will work. That. Let me just quickly get that link. This link should be good forever. Drop that in there. That's the Discord link. We'll get started. So I just want to quickly recap where we were yesterday, what this piece is about. So again, this is Little Man at Chehaw Station by Ralph Ellison. And this is a work that in many ways responds to really, oh, I can see myself in the chat up there. So yeah, apparently it is working. I'd like to get it in dark mode. Apparently, at least the method I used couldn't get it in dark mode. So unfortunately, you have extra brightness on your screen, but alas, solve all of the problems. This work is Ralph Ellison's response to thinking about certain problems about American audiences. And he's thinking about it as an artist. He's a novelist. He wrote a great, or potentially the great American novel, some might say, Invisible Man, not to be confused with H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. This is a novel about a protagonist, a black protagonist, and it's almost in the tradition of picaresque, of someone kind of going on a journey, someone who's kind of in a low position in society going on a journey. Picaresque tradition, but he uses this tradition of the novel to discuss issues of race in America. So in this nonfiction work, so in my class we're reading a little bit of that novel too. Think about audience. It begins with a public speech that I would say doesn't go super well. There's a kind of it's a violently set speech that he has to make for a completely white audience and have a boxing match ahead of time. This kind of almost surreal idea of trying to kind of bring to the fore some of the violence that sometimes may be in the background for people in settings of speech. So he uses a little bit of a surreal. Hello, welcome to the stream. Somebody's popped in. So anyway, so yesterday we talked about the Little Man at Chehaw Station. So just to kind of go over very quickly what he had said before, and there's a lot of rich stuff in this essay, and it's long, and I'm going to try to finish it today. Who knows what will happen. Ralph Ellison, the real person Ralph Ellison, was trumpet player, and got kind of reamed out by his teachers for bad recital. Because of that, goes to Hazel Harrison's house. Hazel Harrison was a great concert pianist, first black concert pianist, black American concert pianist, to perform with the European orchestra. So in her own right, did quite a bit to break barriers, and was an excellent musician. And she said, you always have to perform your best. Not because of some standard of art that you have to hold yourself to, which she probably would agree to, but even more so because in America, there's always a little man behind the stove. So she uses this strange metaphor, and the idea being that even in some godforsaken place, and she uses Chehaw Station, train stop, even in a godforsaken place, there's likely to be somebody who is not from the elite of society, who nevertheless has this kind of democratic taste. They've taken a little bit from everywhere, and now they're ready. Oh, hey, what's up, Steve? I was wondering who is coming in on a Saturday at noon to hear this? Oh, what's up, Alan? Thanks for coming. It's weird because Twitch is still showing me one viewer. Wonder how. Cool, but now you can see yourself in the stream. It's a little bit meta because I added this in. Days of the week are no longer relevant. Well, I mean, that not in my world, because in my world, like, we have to be on this strict COVID testing schedule, and if we miss it, everybody gets messed up. So, like, for me, it's like hyper matters more than it ever has, like what day of the week. But I know for many people that are like fully remote, that it probably is different. I've never seen you in the room. I've never seen you at all, so I've never seen you in the room at the same time. That's true. Yeah. Anyway, so I was just going over what we talked about yesterday. You think you both came in a little bit yesterday, so, and Steve, you know this. Steve introduced me to this essay right now. So props to Steve. If you don't like this essay, you can yell at Steve in the Discord and blame it on him. It's funny because also in the stream that I'm looking at, it's actually faster there than on my phone. Very weird. Very weird stuff. Wonder why. Mammy little bros. And sisses and all sorts of people. Okay. Yeah. So it's not about, it's about the audience, not about the average audience, but about a kind of democratic possibility in an audience of somebody who's kind of is a little bit motley, and he even uses the word motley, and it's a word that I like a lot, and I've used to describe what would be a kind of what our ideal is in this class. Someone else in the class used the term hodgepodge, which I think is also good, as long as we don't think hodgepodge is bad. Sometimes people say, "Oh, that's just hodgepodge." Eclectic. This is a kind of celebration of eclecticism. Say, eclecticism is taking a little bit from everywhere. Ellison likes this eclecticism. A little human behind the stove. Yeah. I mean, this is certainly not like a gender neutral piece, but at a certain point, it would get really tedious if I would always say that. So I'm just going to kind of go through, and for whatever reason, Hazel Harrison, who is a woman, chose to make this a man. It's a fictional, but potentially real sometimes. Characterization, or prosopopeia, is a nice old rhetoric term, when Ralph Ellison makes the little man speak, and he finds examples, right? The Spanish analog, we ended last time on the Spanish analog of the cante hondo singer who sings in a bel canto style. It's a little bit too operatic, and so the member of the audience shouts out, kind of in a heckling, but almost generous kind of heckle. Three cheers for the School of Paris, which is, you know, a bit of a witty retort, right? Because there's no cante hondo in Paris, so they kind of got it off. But that person who's like looking for their traditional music to be performed in the way that they want it to be, also knows enough to be like, yeah, that you're doing it in the Parisian way. So they've kind of grabbed a little bit from it. So here we're going to start here, and I'm going to use my mouse. Sometimes it'll be OCR recognized, and I can kind of use my cursor to highlight the passage, and that should be good for the video. So when you're going back later, you can identify the part of the text that I'm talking about. But for now, since this isn't OCR, I'm just going to kind of use my cursor, and you can vaguely see what page I'm on. If you're following along in the class, you can use this to find the passage that you're really interested in, because these can be quite long. What we've discovered. So, perhaps we shy away from confronting our cultural wholeness because it offers no easily recognizable points of rest, no facile certainties as to who or where, culturally or historically, we are. It's nice to be certain, isn't it? It's comforting to be. We talked a lot last time, like, well, most of life, most of everything that we do exists in uncertainty. Facile means too easy. Too easy. It's a too easy certainty. You arrive there too quick, a little bit hasty. So instead, the whole is always in a cacophonic motion. It's kind of like and this could be a negative way of looking at the motley, that cacophony. There's two different kinds of music playing at once. Cacophony. Sounds bad. Literally from the Greek for means sounds bad. Constantly changing its mode, it appears as a vortex of discordant ways of living and tastes, values and traditions. It's all kind of mixed up. A whirlpool of odds and ends in which the past courses in uneasy juxtaposition. The past courses, using that as a verb. I heard it as a noun first. I read it wrong. I had to go back. And that's okay. This is how you read things. A whirlpool of odds and ends, bricolage, in which the past courses in uneasy juxtaposition with those bright futuristic principles and promises to which we as a nation are politically committed. And in the last reading, he kind of starts talking about the nation as something that really only exists abstractly in terms of the values that we name, even though we don't mean the same things by those values. It still matters. So you could take the cynical position of insight, as Hegel might call it, and say, freedom, that means nothing because everybody means something different by it. But Ellison's saying, well, that's precisely why it's important. That's what makes these conversations possible, is that we can have disagreement because we share, at least in name, the same value. And the examples that we bring forward, what that means, or the ideals that we bring forward under that name, allow us, that is what a nation is. So it's a cacophony. It's not kind of like a uniformity. It's not what it is. Not every identity is uniform. At this point, maybe that's obvious to everybody. But in our vaguely perceived here and now, I love this line. In our vaguely perceived here and now, there's kind of a bias, cognitive bias that we have, that the present moment is what is most obvious. But I think that's, maybe just because I'm a historian of sorts, I think that this can't be the case. Present is often what is most obscure. You don't have any time to reflect on it. You can't compare any notes. You kind of just like have to go. So, and that's what he's saying here. In our vaguely perceived here and now, even the sounds and symbols spun off by the clashing of group against group appear not only alarmingly off-key, but threatening to our inherited eyes, ears, and appetite. So maybe you can think of an example of, what's an example happening right now of the clashing of group against group symbolically? Have that discussion of Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. Sounds similar, and two out of three words are the same. Very different attitudes. How do those relate to each other? Thus, in our intergroup familiarity, there is a brooding strangeness. Brooding, what does he mean here by brooding? You can think of brooding as like the Hamlet type character, someone who's just kind of like thinking a lot, maybe in a kind of sad way. Or brooding also means like bringing something to birth, if like for birds. So maybe he's using it in an ambiguous sense or ambivalent sense. Give us both of those. I'm not sure. But there is a brooding strangeness, and on our underlying sense of alienation, a poignant, although distrusted, sense of fraternity. Deep down, the American condition is a state of unease. So this is not just like in some sense you might read this as the American dream, melting pot, but Ellison's taking that tradition of thinking about America as a kind of plurality, and he's not just kind of endorsing the cliche. He's declining the stereotype, as we talked about before. He's kind of making something new out of this. bringing all these different things. It says the American condition is a state of unease. So there's a kind of dialectical tension within the idea of Americanness itself. What's more American than tension and unease? During the 19th century, that's the 1800s, time of the Civil War and Reconstruction and all that, what preceded it, an attempt was made to impose a loose conceptual order on the chaos of American society, and here we go, by viewing it as a melting pot. Today that metaphor is noisily rejected. It's not a melting pot. We're not together. We haven't been melted. Gotta take water here. Drinking like Trump with 2 hands, but that was mostly because I'm afraid about the electronic equipment around. I'm gonna keep this on the ground. Okay. So, the fact it has come under attack in the name of a newly fashionable code word, ethnicity. Sometimes it's nice to read old things because you get insights like for us, ethnicity would be something that was always available as an idea. And he's like, no, this is kind of newly appeared on the scene. I don't really know the history of all of these discussions about it. I've read a little bit maybe about it, so I have some intuition. For him, this is kind of like a new thing. That's his reflection. That's interesting to learn. Like, oh, well, what if that were something that arrived recently for us? Kind of seems timeless. Maybe it wasn't. Reminding us that in this country, code words are linguistic agencies for the designation of sacrificial victims. There's a lot to unpack here. Again, he's kind of using Burke. So you're told in school, like, you always have to cite your sources. Then you read real writers, and they're always kind of cribbing and taking stuff from each other. And that's just called illusion when they do it. If you do it, as all of your teachers remind you in the syllabus, it's plagiarism. You get kicked out of the university. There's no greater sin than to, well, so what's the difference between plagiarism and illusion? In some sense, it's that it's kind of more artful. He's weaving it into his own kind of argument, these phrases or these concepts. I don't know. I don't want to get this to talk about plagiarism. But I think that maybe the emphasis on plagiarism comes from some anxiety that teachers of writing have about these vegs, these real vegs that occur when you write. How much attribution should be made? That if we took a rhetorical point of view and said, every time that you cite someone, as well as every time that you allude without citing, you're making a rhetorical choice. What are you doing for your audience? So again, audience is the answer. If there's something that you could imagine that an audience would want to know, comes from a particular place and follow up on it, that would be essential. If that would change their point of view on what you're saying, then you should probably cite it. If you are doing it in such a way where you think your audience is already familiar with it, citing it might kind of seem like tedious. So really, often these things that get talked about in this kind of moral register, but also I think maybe better be thought about in the terms of style and audience and rhetoric. That's just a sidebar. So today, before the glaring inequities, unfulfilled promises, and rich possibilities of democracy, we hear heady evocations of European, African, and Asian backgrounds, accompanied by chants proclaiming the inviolability of ancestral blood. Allen says, from the outside with tech stuff, if it's common knowledge, you don't worry about citing even if it comes largely from one. If it's more new idea or really specific, you throw a tip of that. Yeah, I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. But here I would say it's like, well, as Ellison, I wouldn't say that any of the stuff that Burke said is like common knowledge. But he still kind of makes this illusion. And sometimes that's part of the game of a certain kind of literary culture, of making illusions that are really not uncommon. That like the moment when you recognize it, maybe you get that little satisfaction. Then you're filling out a crossword and you're like, oh, I got the clue. So I think that that's a good rule of thumb, basically. Like, you're like, let's just, if you're citing things that are like, on the first page of the Wikipedia page, you probably don't need to. I think that's a good. But again, even that idea of common knowledge refers back to the audience. Common for who? Well, for my audience. Common knowledge for them. If I go to a different place, if I'm speaking to a different audience, what's common knowledge might totally change. If I'm speaking to children, if I'm speaking in a different country, etc. Right? If you, Alan, are speaking to to a conference of coders, what's common knowledge to them is going to be very different if you're talking to me. I don't know anything. I don't really have very much experience at all. So that is still a kind of elastic and rhetorical concept. But yeah, I think common knowledge is a good rule. Today, blood magic and blood thinking, never really dormant in American society, are rampant among us. So what does he mean by blood magic and blood thinking? Well, he's kind of putting an attitude towards people who are trying to kind of, as he said, clinging to that part of their democratic rock, which is the ancestral idea. Like there's some kind of ancestral memory that comes down to us from what's in our blood, our lines. And of course, by putting it in that shade, it maybe reminds you of violence, and also like Nazis, right? Blood and soil, that kind of thing. And so he's maybe kind of trying to show you an attitude that if you're just like, well, my ethnicity is really important to me. If he's like, if you were to change that term ethnicity to blood, and that was like in old law, in like old European law, that was the term that was often used. Relations of consanguinity. And Burke talks a lot about that comes from the Latin for, right? So you think about it, be like, my blood is really important to me. Putting it in that register might actually change your attitude. So there's a little bit of persuasion here happening, not necessarily at the level of like proposition support, but at the shift in terminology. So today, blood magic and blood thinking, never really dormant in American society, are rampant among us, often leading to brutal racial assaults in areas where these seldom occurred before. And while this goes on, the challenge of arriving at an adequate definition of American cultural identity goes unanswered. What, by the way, is one to make of a white youngster who, with a transistor radio, screaming a Stevie Wonder tune, glued to his ear, shouts racial epithets at black youngsters trying to swim at a public beach, and this in the name of the ethnic sanctity of what has been declared a neighborhood turf? So let's put this all in context. He had already talked about, he's like, people don't like this melting pot metaphor. He's like, but wait a minute. Let's think about it. And he's not unaware of the kinds of objections that people have. For someone who's like, yo, I love Stevie Wonder. And who doesn't love Stevie Wonder? I mean, come on. Stevie Wonder is great. But that someone who really likes black culture, black music, is not by that effect an anti-racist. So what are we to make of this? And then he's gonna make his point. It should be, maybe I should remind everyone at this point that Ralph Ellison was black. So maybe I left that part out. That should be obvious, I think, from his ability to write from that perspective in Invisible Man, but I don't know where people are. I keep thinking of a Venn diagram where there's a ton of circles and several of them don't overlap. I mean, that actually is a Venn diagram. Because Venn set out a bunch of different diagrams to visually represent logical relations. So one of them would be two circles where there's no intersection. Yeah, so that would be, but I'm not sure what that's related to. Okay. The proponents of ethnicity, ill concealing an underlying anxiety, and given a bizarre bebopish stridency. Bebop is a kind of form of jazz that became popular, I think, starting in the 50s and into the 60s. And it was known for, like, hard bop. Hard bop would have chord changes on every note. So it'd be like, boom, boom, boom. It was fast. It was kind of like hip. Maybe what you would associate with the beats. Late 40s. What would you say, Steve, is the first bebop album? Like the first bebop artist? Not sure I would know. Yeah, Charlie Parker would definitely be within the bop phenomenon. Sure. Yeah, Parker. Bird would definitely be one. Yeah. But, he had different phases in his... yeah, he's definitely, I think, mostly known for his stuff that would be thought of as... Yeah, many not recorded, right. Yeah, so again, with jazz and with blues as well, many even of the founding people here were not recorded. You had to have people like Alan Lomax going down to the South, recording people for the Library of Congress, and Muddy Waters was like, okay, you gonna pay me? Kind of stuff. So similar for jazz, a lot of the stuff that was happening live in bars, and more of a crowd-pleasing club sort of. Yeah, it was moving away from, we could maybe put it and say it was moving away from maybe the kind of like bandstand orchestra setup that maybe some had become a kind of popular version of jazz. The Beats thought of it as something you do in a crowd and move together. Yeah, yeah. So yeah. Anyway, we could talk about that that all day. This is just one word. So this is why these streams get so long, because I stop to gloss a lot of things. But I like to do that. Given a bizarre bebopish stridency, kind of like it's a little aggressive but stylish kind of attitude, by the obviously American vernacular inspiration of the costumes and rituals ragged out, dramatized their claims to ethnic and genetic insularity. What does it insularity means? I am an island. That's what insula means, island. So when he said, for whom the bell tolls before, he's like, remember, the little man doesn't ask for whom the bell tolls. He just kind of comments on how well the bell is being tolled. He's like, that's not the right way to toll a bell. I toll a bell better, right? And so that was from the same poem where John Donne said, no man is an island. So Ellison is playing deeply here on some literary allusions. Maybe I could be accused of overreading some of these. You have to kind of decode them. And like in any moment when you're trying to decode something, you can kind of like decode yourself out of the text. People sometimes do with religious texts or conspiratorial thinking sometimes. But I think sometimes it's worth trying to. Okay. Have helped give our streets and campuses, hey there folks, a rowdy All Fool's Day carnival atmosphere. In many ways, then, the call for a new social order based upon the glorification of ancestral blood, ethnic background, acts as a call to cultural and aesthetic chaos. The feeling here is that bebop is sort of a democratic style. Democratic forcefulness, so somewhat ironic, but a pleasurable sort of force that doesn't really fit with democracy. Yeah, I'm curious why you say it doesn't really fit with democracy. But that seems like a pretty good characterization of what he's trying to get across here. I think he's kind of pointing out another irony here, that people's kind of like emphasis on, so for instance, in the 80s, a kind of movement for Afrocentricity. He's like, what he's about to show us as an example, it doesn't actually lead you to like kind of a greater insularity. It actually leads to greater chaos when you see all of these things kind of being put together. When everyone's kind of like taking on these styles that they have identified as being like their ethnic tradition or their genetic tradition, it actually leads to, in that Canal Street scene of everybody moving around, even more plurality. So it's this kind of irony. So yet while this latest farcical phase in the drama of American social hierarchy unfolds, farce meaning like almost like slapstick comedy, So he's like he's kind of dismissing this, but he's very interested in it. He's looking into it. It's a kind of attitude you might cultivate. I don't endorse this, but I'm very interested in what it means. The irrepressible movement of American culture toward the integration of its diverse elements continues, confounding the circumlocutions, talking around, of its staunchest opponents. So he's like, ironically, the kind of attempt to say, it's my ethnicity, it's my ancestry, actually leads, from his point of view, and this is a little bit strange, to greater integration. How is that the case? He gives us an example here. In this regard, I am reminded of a light-skinned, blue-eyed, Afro-American featured individual who could have been taken for anything from a sun-tinged white Anglo-Saxon, an Egyptian, or a mixed-breed American Indian. Now, that's maybe not a nice phrase today. I don't think he means it in a derogatory way. To a strayed member of certain tribes of Jews. This young man appeared one sunny Sunday afternoon, on New York's Riverside Drive near 151st Street. This is like uptown New York, uptown Manhattan, where he disrupted the visual peace promenading throng. Promenading means like walking, taking a Sunday stroll, by racing up in a shiny new blue Volkswagen. Volkswagen, we'll call it Beetle. This time, the Volkswagen Beetle is like little bubble car. Kind of associated with the hippie movement, I think. I would think. I might be wrong on that, but I think there was kind of that association. Decked out with a gleaming Rolls-Royce radiator. So that's a little bit of an already kind of weird thing, like this kind of like hippie car with the like, and then he puts on the front of it the radiator of like Rolls-Royce, which is like high-end luxury brand. So it's a little bit weird, right? You get that. it's maybe a little bit the way that some kind of streetwear people wear like Gucci belts and then like or like Versace or you know, some kind of Italian luxury brand, but then they also wear like a New York Yankees cap, and that maybe doesn't seem that weird to us anymore. Yeah, and they're all good. I know this is gonna become like a 5-part video. This is the part I think about when I think about this essay. As the flow of strollers come to an abrupt halt, trams if you're from the UK, come to an abrupt halt, this man of parts emerged. This man of parts, so again that idea of motley. This man of parts emerged from his carriage with something of that magical cornucopian combustion. It's just like, all the fruits of the loom are out, baby, by which a dozen circus clowns are exploded from an even more miniaturized automobile. So even though it's a one guy coming out of the car, the way he comes out of his car is like a whole gaggle of clowns are coming out. He's colorful. Looming as tall as a professional basketball center, so he's very tall. So he also kind of... He unfolded himself and stretched to his full imposing height. And the Beetle is a small car, right? So there's a kind of clownish thing of like a small, tall person in this small car. Clad in handsome black riding boots and fawn-colored riding breeches of English tailoring, he took the curb wielding, with an ultra Puka Sahib haughtiness, a leather riding crop. I think the Puka Sahib refers to kind of like the English colonial relationship in Indian colony, and Jodhpurs. We have a lot of the terms that kind of come into English. Khakis come from this English colonial adoption of Indian style. I mean, in their own kind of weird colonial way. So this leather riding crop. So he's kind of got this weird like. So looks English tailoring. He looks a little bit almost like, in this part of his thing, looks like a English colonial officer or something. Then Adashi Dashiki, as bright and as many colored as the coat that initiated poor Joseph's troubles in biblical times, flowed. So this is an African garment. Flowed from his broad shoulders down to the arrogant military flare of his breeches tops, while 6 feet 6 inches or so above his heels, which is about as tall as he is, right? A black Homburg hat, tilted at a jaunty angle, a little rakish hat. Let's look at what a Homburg hat looks like. I don't know if I know what that is. Let's check it out. What is a Homburg hat? Yeah, it's kind of like a fedora. So this guy's outfit's just wild, right? He's got like English colonial officer, like ANC member, and then like 1920s mafia don hat. Like what? Proto neckbeard vibes. Yeah, except this guy is like 6'6", but yes, yeah, with the hat. Yeah. I think it meant something different. It's interesting to know, like, why did that hat become the kind of sign of the neckbeard person? I think maybe it's because the nostalgia that people who like are still gonna wear like Dio or Metallica t-shirts, like Minecraft t-shirts, but still put that on. Like they kind of have missed the boat on, if you're gonna fully adopt that style, you'd have to like go to a tailor or something. So it's kind of misses the mark. But again, it's another part of this this pluralistic American thing we got going on, is the neckbeard fedora. So he's got this, and floated majestically on the crest of his huge afro-coiffed head. So he's probably got an afro. As though all this were not enough to amaze, delight, or discombobulate his observers, or precipitate an international incident involving the charges of a crass invasion of stylistic boundaries. Cultural appropriation. Right? You've heard this before. He proceeded to unlimber, but the question would be here, if you were to accuse this guy of cultural appropriation, which one would he be appropriating and which one is his? That's kind of the question. So, but then it gets even wilder. He proceeded to unlimber an expensive Japanese single-lens reflex camera, position it atop the ornamental masonry balustrade, so this kind of part of the wall that looks nice, which girds Riverside Park in that area, and activate its self-timer. So he's taking a selfie. Was it cultural appropriation or illegal combining of styles? I read the latter. Oh yeah, I was just kind of making an analogy that maybe my students would be more familiar with. But I think he's kind of making a joke. I think he's trying to be fun. Steve was talking about the Minecraft t-shirts, but no fedora. Hashtag neckbeard fail. I don't think you have a neckbeard. Steve has a quite majestic beard. Say. Or not majestic. I don't know. You have a distinctive beard. It's not a neckbeard. Okay. Then with a ballet leap across the walk, he assumed a position beside his car. So he's taking a selfie. You know, he's a trendsetter. This guy's ahead of his time. There he rested his elbow upon its top, smiled, and gave himself sharp movie director's commands as to desired poses. So he's talking to himself. He's very this is very theatrical. He's like, okay, now a little to the left. Like he's saying it to himself, yeah? It's kind of funny. He's a character. He's a slice. He's a cut up. This done, he placed the camera upon the hood of his Volkswagen and took another series of self-shots. So they don't even have the word selfies yet, so he's calling it self-shots, in which manipulating a lengthy ebony cigarette holder. Now he's got like a cigarette holder, like Breakfast at Tiffany's Audrey Hepburn. He posed himself in various fanciful attitudes against the not-too-distant background of the George Washington Bridge. All in all, he made a scene to haunt one's midnight dreams and one's noon repose. So that's Ellison's attitude there. He's like, what did I just see? Now I can only speculate as to what was going on in the elegant gentleman's mind, who he was, or what visual statement he intended to communicate. I only know that his carefully stylized movements, especially his pimp-limp walk, marked him as a native of the USA, a homeboy bent upon projecting and recording with native verve, energy, something of his complex sense of cultural identity. Yeah. Clearly he had his own style, but if, as had been repeatedly argued, style is the man, or the woman, again, who on earth was this fellow? So if the style is that he's using that old, I think it's pimp limp, which is, there's a whole history to this style of walking. And I don't want to take us too far off track of this reading. But there's a lot of, I think of the Italian Renaissance humanist. Seems very strange as a segue from pimp limp, but Alberti, who's kind of maybe best known today for coming up with the theory of perspective in painting. I mean, he did paint a little bit, but pimp link might make more sense for your brand or band. Lots of Verhoeven happening. But anyway, he said Alberti, or this gets reported on by a German historian later on, said he wanted to kind of be the best in three things: walking, riding, like riding his horse, and speaking. So it's this kind of like cultural dandy. This goes all, I mean, this is all the way back in the 15th century, of someone who's like very attentive to how they walk. You gotta have style and everything you do. And the pimp limp was one of these styles that was, you can, there's all sorts of documentaries about it and stuff. There's a lot that people have said about the style of walk and how it emerged. Yeah, stylizing people's walks. I mean, there's that silly Monty Python sketch about the Ministry of Silly Walks. But I don't think they're all silly, you know. But attending to do a dull or a dangerous thing, as Bukowski says, with style, that's, sometimes, you know, walking could be a dull thing. It could be a dangerous thing. But thinking about how to stylize even mundane tasks might be part of what the little man or woman. Okay. Clearly, he had his own style. But if, as has been repeatedly argued, the style is the man, who on earth was this fellow? Viewed from a rigid ethno-cultural perspective, neither his features nor his car nor his dress was of a whole. Kind of too eclectic. Yet he conducted himself with an obvious pride of person and of property, inviting all and sundry, admire and wonder in response to himself, as his own sign and symbol, his own work of art. He had gotten himself, as the Harlem saying goes, together. And whatever sheerly ethnic identity was communicated by his costume depended upon the observer's ability to see order in apparent cultural chaos. So do you see the dashiki? over the jodhpurs. You know, what's figure and what's background here is outfit. It's kind of it could go any way, right? So it depends on what the audience is bringing to it. The man himself was hidden somewhere within, his complex identity concealed by his aesthetic gesturing. And his essence lay not in the somewhat comic clashing of styles, but in the mixture, the improvised form, the willful juxtaposition of modes. Perhaps to the jaundiced eyes of an adversary of the melting pot concept. Wow, that's kind of a harsh thing. Eyes are kind of jaundiced. You can't see anything but this yellow hue of everything. The man would have appeared to be a militant black nationalist, bent upon dramatizing his feelings of alienation. And he might have been. But most surely he was not an African or an Englishman. His Volks Rolls Royce might well have been loaded with Marxist tracts and Molotov cocktails. But his clashing of styles nevertheless sounded an integrative vernacular. Right? So he's not just wearing one style of thing. He's kind of mixing things up. So he's not so easy to place or to pigeonhole. And maybe that's part of what he's trying to say. Try to pigeonhole me. Who do you think I am? Good luck. And so it's a little bit kind of that vernacular kind of like aggressive, that strident bebop note to it. Be like, who do you think I am? His garments were literally and figuratively of many colors and cultures, his racial identity interwoven of many strands. Whatever his politics, sources of income, hierarchical status, and such, he revealed his essential Americanness in his freewheeling assault upon traditional forms of the Western aesthetic. And in my class, we're also going to read Frederick Douglass on picture taking. And I think also thinking about him kind of taking selfies as part of the gesture of kind of claiming but also reconfiguring the stereotyped identity of in Frederick Douglass, and in this man's case, of what black men are supposed to look like. That's also part of a kind of rhetorical gesture. Whatever the identity he presumed to project, he was exercising an American freedom and was a product of the melting pot, a conscious or unconscious comedy it brews. Culturally, he was an American joker. What's so funny? I don't think he means like that. If his afro and dashiki symbolized protest, his boots, camera, Volkswagen, and Hamburg imposed certain qualifications upon that protest. In doing so, they played irreverently. Right? So we talked about piety before, and both Ellison and Berkey's idea of piety. They don't mean just the simple meaning of it as religious piety. We all got pieties. You know, what do you have to respect? What do you get angry about if someone disrespects? Yeah, we all have pieties. If you don't, are you okay? Need to talk a little bit? We all have pieties. So, irreverence is to say, your pieties ain't mine. So, in doing so, they played irreverently upon the symbolism of status, property, and authority. Putting the Rolls-Royce bumper on a Volkswagen Beetle is pretty funny, and suggested new possibilities of perfection. New possibilities of perfection, think about that. The idea of like the perfect. Well, it's like, well, the perfect what? If you create a new thing, there's a new kind of perfection. More than expressing protest, these symbols ask the old, abiding American questions. Who am I? What about me? I don't think those are uniquely the purview of Americans, but there's a certain American way of saying it, maybe. Still, ignoring such questions, as they would ignore the little man of Chehaw Station, the opponents of the melting pot concept utter their disavowals with an old-fashioned camp meeting fervor. He makes these great little allusions to parts of experience that he just kind of, folds in really quickly in an adjective. Camp meeting fervor. Well, what's camp meeting fervor, right? Like we're all kind of in the same scout troop, yeah. So it's already assumed that there's going to be a kind of uniformity of opinion. Solemnly and with an air of divine revelation. Most amazingly, so piously, most amazingly, these attacks upon the melting pot are led by the descendants of peasants or slaves or inhabitants of European ghettos. People whose status as spokesmen is a product of that very melting of hierarchical barriers, which they now deny. So basically, not the WASPs. everybody else. I don't know, is WAS, is that an offensive term now? White Anglo-Saxon Protestant? With such an attitude, it is fortunate that they too are caught up in the society's built-in, democracy-prodded movement toward a perfection of self-definition. Hence, such disavowals, despite their negative posture, have their positive content. And to the extent they are negatives uttered in an attempt to create certain attitudes, conditions that their exponents perceive as positives, these disavowals are, in part, affirmations of the diverse and unique past out of which have emerged the many groups that this nation compromises. As such, they might well contribute to a clarification of our pluralistic cultural identity, and thus a step in the direction of creating a much-needed cultural intersection. So Ellison's doing something very strange here, and again, this dialectical kind of like holding together unity and division. He's saying even the people who are saying there's no melting pot, we aren't integrated, and they are pointing to the evidence, which Ellison would agree with, of segregation, of injustice, of inequality. He's saying, yet even so, that very disavowal is itself a kind of movement towards that integration. When you hold it all together. So yeah, all of these cultures and all of these grievances are here together in some kind of unity. There wouldn't be grievances were there not some unity. It's not a unity of opinion. It's not a unity of attitude. It's kind of a unity of diversity. A strange, seemingly contradictory concept, dialectical. As of now, however, I see the denial of that goal of cultural integration, for which the melting pot was an accented metaphor, as the current form of an abiding American self-distrust. I see it as an effort to dismiss the mystery of American identity, our unity within diversity, with a gesture of democracy-weary resignation, as an attempt to dispel by sociological word magic. Sociological word. So some of maybe those buzzwords that you hear, turbulence of the present, and as a self-satisfied vote against that hope, which is so crucial to our cultural and political fulfillment. So you got to have hope. You got to have your eyes fully open to the present. You can't be deluded about how bad things are, and how could you be right now? I know, I guess you could be. How do you still have hope? What is hope? What's the practice of hope? For if such disavowals be viable, what about the little man behind the stove? Speaking of hope, I was having a conversation. I think a lot of us have had conversations with our parents about, especially after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, after their deaths or their murders, at the hands of police. And, my mom, a little older, but really open, wanted to know how she could better understand what was happening. Protest. She said, I just want to be hopeful. And I think that was like a good, I thought I was like, that's a good kind of attitude to have. And in that moment, I said something, I wasn't sure even what I meant when I said it. But sometimes I say things and I think about them later. What did I mean? And I said, but this is the hope. This isn't the problem, the protest. This is the hope. So hope might not look like optimism in every case. Hope might mean a kind of practice that acknowledges a possibility. Things being different. And if you think everything's great now, you don't need hope, do you? What would you be hoping for right now? So being hopeful doesn't mean that you ignore the problems of the present, just the inverse. It means that you are so invested in the problems of the present that you are always looking and inquiring into possibilities, other alternatives of meaning, of practice, alternative ways to organize our institutions and ourselves. And that hope is politics. That's not what everyone means by politics, but that's kind of what I mean by politics. Anyway, another sidebar. Ironically, the attacks on the melting pot idea issue from those who have made it. Having been reborn into a higher hierarchical status, they now view those who have not made it as threats to their newly achieved status, and hence would change both the rules and the game plan. Thus they demonstrate anew the built-in opportunism of their characteristically shortness of memory. But lest we ourselves forget, the melting pot concept was never so simplistic or abstract, as current arguments would have it. Americans of an earlier day, despite their booster extravagances, booster meaning like the kind of optimistic, the land is paved with gold, manifest destiny, that kind of stuff, recognized the difference between the ideal and the practical, even as they clung desperately to and sought to default upon the responsibilities that went with achieving their democratic ideal. Their outlook, pragmatic, their way with culture vernacular, an eclectic mixing of modes. Having rejected the hierarchical ordering of traditional societies, they improvised their culture as they did their politics and institutions, touch and go by ear and by eye, fitting new form to new function, a little bit bebop maybe. Deep down, they sensed that in the process of nation building, their culture, like their institutions, was always more American, that futuristic concept. America's not here, it's there, future, than they could perceive, or even fully accept it to be. Even the slaves, although thrust below the threshold of social hierarchy, he doesn't say at the bottom of social hierarchy, thrust below even the social hierarchy. There are some scholars talking now about the social death of the slave. The slave was not alive to society. Below the lowest possibility. Nevertheless, supporting it all in a very real way. Were given a prominent place in our national iconography. Their music, poetic imagery, choreography were grudgingly recognized as seminal sources of American art. In the process of creating and recreating or diverting themselves, the melting pot Americans brazenly violated their ideals. They kept slaves or battened on the products of slave labor. I'm not sure what that means here. Battened. Like, I know batten down the hatches. Strengthen. So maybe if you batten something on, it's kind of strengthening. Okay. Might not be really sure. I think I get the idea, though. They kept slaves or battened on the products of slave labor. They exploited and abused those who arrived later than themselves, kinsmen and aliens alike. While paying lip service to their vaunted forms of justice, they betrayed, brutalized, and scapegoated one another in the name of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and the Ten Commandments. So Ellison's like, there was a melting pot, and it was, he doesn't have any illusions about how brutal and hypocritical these ideals were and how often they were misused, and even in the name of that, name of these things, people were betraying one another. But because of the fidelity to their parents' customs and their respect for the pieties of their traditions, not for those of their fellows, none of the groups that made up the total culture ever really desired to lose a sense of its unique past, not even when that past lay clouded in slavery. Indeed, they wished to use the techniques, ways of life, and values developed within their respective backgrounds as sources of morale in that continuing process of antagonistic cooperation, another apparent contradiction, of adjusting the past to the present and the future, which was so necessary in building what they imagined as a more humane society. Indeed, during their most candid, self-accepting moments, they saw themselves as living embodiments of the ancestral past, people who had seized the democracy-sponsored opportunity to have a second chance. As such, they saw themselves as the best guarantee that whatever was most desirable and salvageable from the past, we talked about tradition coming from the word to drag. You've got to drag the past into the present. That's what tradition is. It doesn't just arrive there. Would be retained and brought to flower, free of hierarchical hindrances. The little man behind the stove would know from his own condition the melting pot concept was a conceit. That is, an idea, a kind of like artificially imposed idea. You might write a poem with a conceit. John Donne again. You and I are like the legs of a compass. I'm going away, I move around you, and then we come together again. The conceit is that metaphor. But his forced awareness of American cultural pluralism would assure him that it was by no means the product of a con game contrived by the powerful. Here, not even the powerful were so perceptive. So our current disavowals are not only misdirected. Hello. I wonder why I did that. I wonder, was I disconnected? Anyway. Hopefully it's been going on. I don't really know. Got disconnected. I'm just going to keep going. I didn't get any alert or anything. Yeah, the duration seems to be... Well, that's okay. Oh, I was just asking whether... Because I got like a notification that said, welcome to the chat room. I was like, oh, was I disconnected? But it doesn't seem like I was. So I was just trying to... I'm always kind of like worried about... Because I've done it several times. I've just kind of silently... Like there's the sound cuts out or something. But no... That might just be the app, yeah. It just like kind of randomly does that. Okay. Yeah, no biggie. Still learning. I'm going to skip this paragraph because I think it actually is kind of repetitive. It's the same idea. We'll go to the one about the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims began by appropriating the agricultural, military, and meteorological lore of the Indians, including much of their terminology. The Africans, thrown together from numerous ravaged tribes, took up the English language and the biblical legends of the ancient Hebrews, and were Americanizing themselves long before the American Revolution. So many spirituals talk about the Exodus, right? So the even though the kind of Christianity that was imposed upon slaves as they came from Africa, where either they were, many of them were Muslim, or they had a kind of some kind of ancestor worship or an indigenous religious belief. They nevertheless took that tradition of Christianity and found in it stories that were about the freeing of the slaves, right? That's really what a lot of the story of Moses is about. And that became part of their songs and their culture, and kind of using something that was imposed upon them violently in terms of resistance. Same thing happened in the indigenous, with indigenous people in Latin America. And that's a very complex topic, but the kind of imageries, the kind of like cults of the Virgin that often Spanish and sometimes Portuguese colonizers brought with them as Catholics, a little bit different in North America, mostly Protestant, so not as much emphasis on Virgin Mary, that the indigenous people who were kind of forcibly converted then used that imagery and then kind of converted those virgin cults into things that resembled their indigenous culture. And that actually influenced the European art that went back from the colonies. So these, even as there is violence and imposition, the way of kind of accepting something and then kind of transforming it from the inside through emphasis or through selection, through something that's creative. We talked in class about the woman who takes things that creepy men say to her, she's recording them, and then makes them into art. Right? This is a part of the development of cultures of sometimes it's called the subaltern, someone who's in a kind of low social position or no social position, nevertheless can have these forces upon even the dominant culture. I think that's kind of what he's talking about. They also had imposed upon them a goodly portion of European chromosomes. He's referring to something extremely horrific about American slavery, and you take anything and it's very horrific. But Frederick Douglass talks about in his narrative of his life how slave owners would purchase slave women for the purpose of raping them and thereby making their own children into slaves. And he believed that, Frederick Douglass believed that this was his case, but he never knew for certain. He believed that his father was his master, his owner. So, I mean, at every level, horrifying. This was not a kind of like incidental horror. This was part of the institution of slavery in America. So, that's what he's talking about there. And thereby inherited both an immunity to certain European diseases and a complexity of bloodlines and physical characteristics that have much to do with the white Americans' reluctance to differentiate between race and culture, African and American, are a major source of our general confusion over American identity. Because it turns out there's no such thing as purity here, in that racist sense of genetic purity. One of the many questions posed by the man on Riverside Drive is how one so white could be simply black without being impossibly simple-minded. So remember, this guy is kind of light-skinned, and he's got blue eyes, but he is, as he says, he has kind of features, black features. Especially when his skin and facial bone structure ask, where went the blood of yesteryear? So there he's referring to a very old poem, Où sont les neiges d'antan? Where are the snows of yesteryear? Which is this kind of refrain in this old poem by Villon. And there is no point in answering the question as did Villon, because the man's face was as Anglo, and his hairstyle as Afro, as his car's radiator and body were English and German, respectively. Everyone played the appropriation game, so we are talking about this, yeah? The whites took over any elements of Afro-American culture that seemed useful, imagery of folklore, ways of speaking, endurance of what appeared to be hopeless hardship, and singing and dancing, including the combination of Afro-American art forms that produced the first musical theater of national appeal, the minstrel show, which, as we know today, I think, is deeply racist. But it was part of American culture. Many parts of American culture continue to be deeply racist. And improvising their rather tawdry and opportunistic version of a national mythology, the movie makers, Christian and Jewish, Northerners and Southerners, ransacked and distorted to their own purposes the backgrounds and images of everyone, including the American Indians, and that great American genre of the Western often has the Indians portrayed as savages or just villains, essentially. So melting pot disclaimers notwithstanding, Americans seem to have sensed intuitively that the possibility of enriching the individual self by such pragmatic and opportunistic appropriations has constituted one of the most precious of their many freedoms. So again, another kind of dialectical movement. Ellison saying, yeah, all of this was violent and racist in the highest degree. And nevertheless, the result of that, the cultural result of that violence, isn't something that you can thereby then say, well, I don't want to participate in. And in fact, there's something precious in that. Now we have to be careful and not think that because the result of something, or a result of something, might be something that is valued, that the cause of it is valued. That's a very easy mistake to make. And it's one that I think leads to a lot of the kind of moral hyperventilation around certain kind of uses of American culture. Who gets to do what and when and where and why. All of those conversations I think are important to have, but sometimes it does become kind of brittle because any kind of endorsing or any kind of interest shown or curiosity shown, or someone kind of coming maybe naively to a part of culture that they don't know the origin for it, or might be castigated or shooed away from it because of their identity and the relationship of their identity to the cause of this, or the perceived cause. But I think what Ellison is trying to say is that itself is inconsistent, because there's no beginning of American culture where it's not mixed. It's mixed and appropriated all the way through. It's not cultural appropriation. Culture, at least American culture, is appropriation. All the way down. So, that's what he said. Having opted for the new and being unable to create it out of thin air from words inscribed on documents of state, they did what came naturally. They pressured the elements of the past and present into new amalgams, synthesis. in lieu of a usable cultural tradition, there were always the cultural improvisations of the Afro-Americans, the immigrants, or design-gifted religious groups like Shakers. Shakers are kind of famous for their furniture, being very simple furniture, but quite beautiful. They also didn't last very long because they had a religious belief against reproduction. So you kind of have to be really, really active recruiters if that is the way that your group works. Also close to eye and ear, hand, and imagination, considering that the newness achieved by Americans has often been a matter of adapting to function, and a matter of naming, of nation. We are reminded of how greatly the Americanness of American culture has been a matter of Adamic wordplay, of trying in the interest of a futuristic dream to impose unity upon an experience that changes too rapidly for linguistic or political exactitude. Okay, what is Adamic wordplay? Well, Adam in the Hebrew Bible, right? Adam in the beginning and Eden, you have those Edenic promises that he referred to before. One of the things that happens early on, before they got kicked out of Eden, is God says to Adam, name the animals. And there's a long tradition of Jewish and Muslim and Christian theories of language. That language begins in naming. Specifically, with that religious idea, the naming of Adam, the first person. And then there's that other story, Tower of Babel, where that originary language, everything is properly designated. God punishes the people, the hubris of these people trying to build a tower to him. And then all of their languages become. This is a very traditional idea in many Abrahamic. I'm actually not sure if there's much talk of Babel in. I'll have to look into that second myth. Okay. In this effort, we are less often interested in what we are than in projecting what we will be. But in our freewheeling appropriations of... Someone wrote... what's the guy's name? Political pundit who just wrote a book called 1 Billion Americans. And his solution to all of our cultural problems is that we just need more of us, so that we have as many people as China. This seems like just like even on face kind of laughable, like laughably dumb to me. But I guess it's part of that tradition, projecting it what we will be. It seems like a really dumb version of that, personally, but I haven't read the book, so maybe it's secretly brilliant. I doubt it. Okay, moving on a little bit. Pick up the pace. So perhaps the complex actuality of our cultural pluralism is perplexing because the diverse interacting elements that surround us, traditional and vernacular, not only elude accepted formulations, take on a character that is something other than their various parts. More than the sum of its parts, right? It's not just a little bit. The guy wearing the dashiki and the fedora is not just a little bit dashiki and a little bit fedora. Combination creates something totally new. And that newness is American in that kind of underdetermined way. What does it really mean? I don't know. It's that guy, whatever that guy is. Our old familiar pasts become, in juxtaposition with elements appropriated from other backgrounds, incongruously transformed, exerting an energy or synergy of a different order than that generated by their separate parts. And this with incalculable results. We don't really know what's going to happen from that interaction. Nor should we forget the role played by objects and technology in the integration of our cultural styles and in the regional and political unification of the nation. We put the blues, bluegrass music, English folk songs, etc., together with Afro-American rhythms and gospel shouts. We have God Help Us, first rock, and now funk, that most odoriferous of musical styles. So, I mean, Ellison's maybe a little bit, he doesn't seem to like funk music. I don't really know why, but he's kind of like, it's funky, right? Funk. What does funk mean outside of the music? It means it's kind of stinky, right? That music that's just kind of like, it's a mixture of it's got all sorts of jammed up stuff in it. The mothership has landed, right? And also, yeah, and the science fiction gets involved with George Clinton and Sun Ra, you know, so things get wild. And it's all coming from these various traditions that are part of American experience, but they're not. Can't separate them out. You're like, I want the funk that doesn't have any influence from the Appalachian tradition. Well, like, how are you gonna There's no centrifuge you can spin the cultural product in that it's going to kind of come back out. The transformation doesn't go both ways. So all these synthesis, all these synthetic processes of American culture, and their complexity and violence and stupidity in many cases, nevertheless result in things that are distinct and unique and new. And our attitudes towards them don't have to be the same as the attitudes towards their causes or their ingredients, so to speak. I kind of like funk. Sometimes. Gotta be in a mood. The radio station where I grew up used to have Funky Fridays. Every Friday night you could turn on the radio. Funk music. I think that was Penn's radio. So even more mysteriously, and here perhaps we have a further source of the Little Man of Chehaw Station's rich sensibility, they provide for exciting and most unexpected metamorphoses within the self-creating melody. Always in the mood for funk. All right, Alan, I'll keep that in mind. I'm trying to think about how to get some music in the stream, but I don't want to, since I'm putting stuff on YouTube, I don't want to, get taken down. So I gotta be creative with that. I know Steve has some ideas. Trying to keep it free in every sense. Frankly, many of the foregoing speculations have been arrived at over the years since I left Tuskegee. If I had been more mature, perceptive back when I first heard of the little man behind the stove, an object that lay atop Miss Harrison's piano would have been most enlightening. So look at this. He brings us back to that initial scene, right? There's something on her piano. He's a great writer. He knows what he's doing here. It was a signed Prokofiev manuscript that had been presented to her by the composer. Except for the signature, it looked like countless other manuscripts, yet I suspect that to anyone who possessed a conventional notion of cultural, hierarchical order, its presence in such a setting would have been as incongruous as a Gutenberg Bible on the altar of a black sharecropper church. Right? Because Hazel Harrison is black. Prokofiev is one of the great European masters. Still, there it was. An artifact of contemporary music. A folio whose signs... Oh, I should explain the Gutenberg Bible. Gutenberg Bible is one of the first Bibles printed by Gutenberg. Invents, the history is complicated, but invents the printing press in Europe. So that, imagine like this, the book collector's like wet dream, and it's on like maybe a black sharecropper's altar would. It's hard to imagine. But if you grew up in a city, maybe those kind of like those churches, which is like it'll say like the first Unitarian Church of Christ in unity or something, and it's like an old it used to be a noodle shop or something, storefront church. Imagine the church that was using where that was. They're like, oh, we have this Gutenberg Bible. If you have a conventional view, you're like, wow, that's really incongruous. That's strange. And this is the kind of view that colonial museum administrators often use when they're kind of defending the plunder that represents their collection. They're like, well, we can't put it back where it came from. Surely that they couldn't take care of it. So what's more incongruous? The Elgin marbles being in the British Museum? Or being back at the Parthenon? Or just like the first floor of the Metropolitan Museum, where it's like Oceania, Africa. It's just like it's just the global South broadly. Like all of these things that were stolen or collected from various colonial expeditions, and they're kind of all put together. Well, they belong here. So that's a pretty particular view, right? That's the conventional. But he's saying, still there it was. Once there, and the arrangement of society behind the campus notwithstanding, it spoke eloquently of the unstructured possibilities of culture and its pluralistic democracy. Yet despite its meticulous artistic form, in certain conventional minds, that's not a compliment. Oh, you have a conventional mind. In certain conventional minds, its presence could arouse intimations of the irrational, of cultural, if not social chaos. Given the logic of a society ordered along racial lines, Miss Harrison's studio, or even the library, was simply off limits for such an artifact, certainly in its original form. But there it was, lying in wait to play havoc with conventional ideas of order, lending awry realities to Malraux's observation that art is an assault upon logic. He was a French novelist. Through its presence, the manuscript had become an agency of cultural transformation and synthesis. By charging Miss Harrison's basement studio with the spirit of living personages, ideals, and purposes from afar, Russia, it had transformed that modest room from a mere spot on a segregated Negro campus into an advanced outpost on the frontiers of contemporary music, thus adding an unexpected, if undetected, dimension, Alabama's cultural atmosphere. In my innocence, I viewed the manuscript as a property of Miss Harrison's, a sign of her connection with gifted artists across the ocean. So if you expand the scope and you see, like, isn't it interesting to see this manuscript in Alabama, near Tuskegee, rather than, oh, but she's the exception to the rule. That it spoke to me of possibility, but that it also endowed the scene, play studio campus, with a complex cultural ambiguity escaped my conscious mind. So it's not just about Hazel Harrison. She's part of this environment. She's not an exception to it. So he kind of symbolically expands the scope of the effect of seeing this Prokofiev manuscript. High culture, supposedly high culture, in this more democratic atmosphere. Though aware of certain details of the total scene, I was unattuned to the context in which they sounded. Cultural unity within diversity, the combination of details made manifest. Perhaps we were able to see only that which we are prepared to see. And in our culture, the cost of insight is an uncertainty. It threatens our already unstable sense of order and requires a constant questioning of accepted assumptions. Had I questioned Miss Harrison as how did the racial identity of her little Chehaw man squared with the culture she credited to him, she might have well replied, "Look, baby." This is more prosopopeia. "Look, baby." You can kind of hear her attitude towards it. She's not taking any bullshit. She's still kind of like taking him under her wing. A little bit of a complex attitude. I can't do it justice, but the society behind this campus is constantly trying to confuse you as to the relationship between culture and race. Well, if you ask me, artistic talent might have something to do with race, but you do not inherit culture, almost definitionally, and artistic skill through your genes. No, sir. These come as a result of personal conquest, of the individual's applying himself to that art, that music, jazz, classical, or folk, which helps him to realize and complete himself. And that's true wherever the music or art of his choice originates. This is like strange after this whole kind of idea of democracy thing. This is this like strong, almost individualistic manifesto. Or in the words of André Malraux, whom I was to discover a year or two later, she might have told me that music is important as an artistic form of symbolic action. Sometimes people say, enough talking, let's do something, let's act. Well, speech might be a kind of action, symbolic action, because its function is to let men escape from their human condition, not by a means of an evasion, but through a possession. We talked about habit being what you have. Culture, have, habit. For art is a way of possessing destiny. And that, therefore, even at racially segregated Tuskegee, as witnessed by, among countless other details, the library in her Prokofiev manuscript, one's cultural heritage is the totality, not of works that men must respect. And people hate that, kind of being like, oh, you the canon, you're gonna make me respect that. Who are you to say what's good and bad, right? She's saying, no, it's not that, but those that can help them live. And Kenneth Burke defined literature as equipment for entering into dialogue with Malraux. She might have added on a more specifically American note. Yes, and most important, you must remember that in this country things are always all shook up, so that people are constantly moving around and culturally rubbing off on one another. Nor should you forget that here all things, institutions, individuals, and roles offer more than the function assigned them, because beyond their intended function, they provide forms of education and criticism. They challenge, they ask questions, they offer subjective answers to those who would pause and probe their mystery. Most of all, remember that it is not only the images of art or the sound of music that pass through walls to give pleasure and inspiration. It is in the very spirit of art, to be defiant of categories and obstacles. They are as transcendent forms of symbolic expression, agencies of human freedom. Maybe we should give some snaps for that. 3 years later, after having abandoned my hope of becoming a musician, I had just about forgotten Miss Harrison's mythical little man behind the stoop. This is the thing. I told you to read all the way to the end, because this is the story that makes it all come together. Forces you to read all the way through. Then in faraway New York, concrete evidence of his actual existence arose and blasted me like the heat from an internally combusted ton of... That's an image that he dangles out there that is relevant to the story that he's about to tell. Very clever guy. As a member of the New York Writers Project, I was spending a clammy late fall afternoon of freedom, circulating a petition in support of some now long forgotten social issue that I regarded as indispensable to the public good. I found myself inside a tenement building in San Juan Hill, a Negro district that appeared with the coming of Lincoln Center. Starting on the top floor of the building, I had collected an acceptable number of signatures, and having descended from the ground floor to the basement, was moving along the dimly lit hallway toward the door, through which I could hear loud voices. They were male Afro-American voices, raised in violent argument. The language was profane, the style of speech a Southern idiomatic vernacular, such as was spoken by formerly uneducated Afro-American working men. Reaching the door, I paused, sounding out the lay of the land before knocking to present my petition. So he's kind of listening in. I'm like, what's really going on? And they're being pretty loud. So maybe that's, he's not eavesdropping too much. But my delay led to indecision. Not, however, because of the loud, unmistakable anger sounding within. Being myself a slum dweller, I knew that voices in slums are often raised in anger, but that the rhetoric of anger, being in itself cathartic, is not necessarily a prelude to physical violence. You live in an apartment building, like speaking loudly, speaking forcefully. This might be a style that helps people kind of like feel their way out of difficult situations. Doesn't necessarily always mean that they're about to hit each other. Rather, it is frequently a form of symbolic action. Back to this again. A verbal equivalent of fisticuffs. Meaning, we're not going to fight actually, because we're going to fight verbally. No, I hesitated because I realized that behind the door, a mystery was on. A mystery so incongruous, outrageous, and surreal that it struck me as a threat to my sense of rational order. And he's there, you think he's like a kind of a social do-gooder type. And yet he says, it's like, I've lived in poorer areas where I'm from too, and yet nevertheless, this is shocking to me. It was as though a bizarre practical joke had been staged, and its perpetrators were waiting for me, this designated but unknowing scapegoat, to arrive. A joke designed to assault my knowledge of American culture and its hierarchical dispersal. At the very least, it appeared that my pride in my knowledge of my own people was under attack. So he's like, these are my people. He's black, they're black. Learning something about himself. This encounter. For the angry voices behind the door were proclaiming an intimate familiarity with a subject of which, by all the logic of their linguistically projected social status, right? You kind of people make guesses about your education or background based on how you're talking about here. They should have been oblivious. You shouldn't know that if you know about the subject. What is the subject? The subject of their contention confounded all my assumptions regarding the correlation between educational levels, class, race, and the possession of conscious culture. Impossible as it seemed, these foul-mouthed black working men were locked in verbal combat over which of two celebrated metropolitan opera divas was the superior soprano. So these guys are arguing about opera, angrily, loudly, in a tenement building. I myself attended the opera only when I could raise the funds, and I knew full well that opera-going was far from the usual cultural pursuit of men identified with the linguistic style of such voices. The opera's pretty white, people, right? You go to the Met, even when you wear blue jeans sometimes, kind of like, ooh, a little out of place. And yet, confounding such facile logic, they were voicing in loudly familiarity with the Met far greater than my own. In their graphic, irreverent, and vehement criticism, they were describing not only the soprano's acting ability, but were ridiculing the gestures with each gave animation to her roles. And they shouted strong opinions as to the ranges of the diva's vocal equipment. Thus, with such a distortion of perspective being imposed upon me, I was challenged either to solve the mystery of their knowledge by entering into their midst, so going to the door, or to leave the building with my sense of logic reduced forever to the level of college-trained absurdity. I really hope that you don't leave my class with only college-trained absurdity, but, you know, I'm doing my best. So challenged, I knocked. I knocked out of curiosity. I knocked out of outrage. I knocked in fear and trembling. Another little illusion there, that one. I knocked in anticipation of whatever insights, malicious or transcendent, I no longer cared which, I would discover beyond the door. For a moment there was an abrupt and portentous silence. Then came the sound of chair legs thumping dully upon the floor, followed by further silence. I knocked again loudly with an authority fired by an impatient and anxious urgency. Again silence, until a gravel voice boomed and annoyed, "Come in!" Opening the door with an unsteady hand, I looked inside, and was even less prepared for that scene that met my eyes than for the content of their loudmouth contention. In a small, rank-smelling, lamp-lit room, 4 huge black men sat sprawled around a circular dining room table, looking toward me with undisguised hostility. The sooty, chimneyed lamp glowed in the center of the bare oak table, casting its yellow light upon 4 water tumblers and a half-empty pint of whiskey. As the men straightened in their chairs, I became aware of a fireplace, with a coal fire glowing in its grate, and leaning against the ornate marble facing of its mantelpiece, saw 4 enormous coal scoops. So these are all the coal scooping workers. "All right," one of the men said, rising to his feet. "What the hell can we do for you?" "We ain't buying nothing, buddy," one of the seated men added, his palm slapping the table. So they're really like angry at him. He just knocked on the door. Closing the door, I moved forward, holding my petition like a flag of truce before me. That's pretty funny, because, you know, like, a white flag would often be kind of surrender. He's like holding the paper like it's his petition. Noting that the men wore faded blue overalls and jumper jackets, becoming aware that they were all of dark complexion, their blackness was accentuated in the dim lamplight by the dust and grime of their profession. "Come on, man, speak up," the man who had arisen said. "We ain't got all day." "Sorry to interrupt," I said, "but I thought you might be interested in supporting my petition," and began hurriedly to explain. "Say," one of the men said, "you look like one of them relief investigators. You're not out to jive us, are you?" "Oh, no, sir," I said. "I happen to work on the Writers' Project." The standing man leaned toward me. "You on the Writers' Project?" he said, looking me up and down. "That's right," I said. "I'm a writer." "Now, is that right? How long you been writing?" I hesitated. "About a year." He grinned, looking at the others. "Y'all hear that? Old homeboy here has done up and jumped on the gravy train, making that good money. Now that's pretty good, pretty damn good." "So what did you do before that?" he said. "I studied music," I said. "Tuskegee." "Hey now," the standing man said, "they got a damn good choir down there." So this guy knows a little bit about music too. Yeah, the opera and Tuskegee Institute. Y'all remember back when they opened Radio City? They had fellow William L. Dawson for director. Son, let's see that paper. Because he doesn't even care about the petition, he just kind of wants to know where he's coming from. Relieved, I handed him the petition, watching him stress it between his hardened hands. Now it's probably covered in coal dust, right? After a moment of soundlessly mouthing the words of its appeal, he gave me a skeptical look and turned to the other. "What the hell? Signing this paper won't do no good, but since home here's a musician, it won't do us no harm to help him out. Let's go along with him." So he's kind of a little cynical. He's like, petitions don't do anything. Fishing a blunt, pointed pencil from the bib of his overalls, he wrote his name and passed the petition to his friends, who followed suit. This took some time, and as I watched the petition move from hand to hand, I could barely contain myself or control my need to unravel the mystery that had now become far more important than just getting their signatures on my petition. "There you go," the last one said, sending the petition toward me. "Having our names on there don't mean a thing, but you got them." "Thank you," I said. "Thank you very much." They watched me with amused eyes, expecting me to leave, but clearing my throat nervously, I stood in my tracks, too intrigued to leave and suddenly too embarrassed to ask my question. "What are you waiting for?" one of them said. "You got what you came for. What else do you want?" Then I blurted it out. "I'd like to ask you just one question." "Like what?" the standing one said. "Where on earth did you gentlemen learn so much about grand opera?" For a moment he stared at me with parted lips. Then, pounding the mantelpiece with his palm, he collapsed with a roar of laughter. As the laughter of the others erupted like a string of giant firecrackers, you guys laughed loud, I looked on with growing feelings of embarrassment and insult, trying to grasp the handle of what appeared to be an unfriendly joke. Thinks they're laughing at him. Finally, wiping coal dust-stained tears from his cheeks, he interrupted his laughter long enough to initiate me into the mystery. "Hell, son," he laughed, We learned it down at the Met. That's where. You learned it where? At the Metropolitan Opera, just like I told you. Strip us fellows down and give us some costumes, and we make about the finest damn bunch of Egyptians you ever seen. Hell, we've been down there wearing leopard skins and carrying spears or waving things like palm leaves and ostrich tails fans for years. Now purged by the revelation, and with Hazel Harrison's voice echoing in my ears, it was my turn to roar out with laughter. With a shock of recognition, I joined them in appreciation of the hilarious American joke that centered on the incongruities of race, economic status, and culture. My sense of order restored, my appreciation of the arcane ways of American cultural possibility vastly extended. The men were products of both past and present, were both coal heavers and Met extras, were both working men and opera buffs. Seen in the clear, pluralistic, melting pot light of American cultural possibility, there is no contradiction. The joke, the apparent contradiction, sprang from my attempting to see them by the light of social concepts that cast less illumination than an inert lump of. I was delighted because during a moment when I least expected to encounter the little man behind the stove, Miss Harrison's vernacular music critic, I had stumbled upon 4 such men. And it's almost funny because they were almost literally behind the stove, right? Poll workers. Not behind the stove, it is true, but even more wondrously, they had materialized at an even more unexpected location, at the depth of the American social hierarchy, and of all possible hiding places, behind a coal pile. Where there's a melting pot, there's smoke. And where there's smoke, it is not simply optimistic to expect fire. It's imperative to watch for the phoenix's vernacular, ascendant, rising. I'll leave that last image for you to contemplate. But know about the phoenix, right? Just a little bit about the myth of the phoenix. Phoenix, there's only supposed to be one of them. So it doesn't have an ancestral line. It doesn't have babies. It lives its life. It's fiery life. It's a bird of fire. And there's one story where it kind of carries its one father to sun and burns it up. But there's another one where it just it burns up itself. And then out of the ashes, it rises again. Kind of self-combusting and then arising from the ash, from the coal dust. Say. Watch for the phoenix's vernacular. Something to think. Well, that's the reading for today. Thank you for hanging out if you're here presently. Thank you for watching this if you're watching it. I'm curious what you think about this essay. There's a lot that could be said about it. I would say that one of the things that it does is yeah, thanks, Alan. It does a few things. It kind of tries to transform your attitude that you might have about things that are familiar, like the idea of the melting pot. And he gives you kind of a very different take, I think, on the melting pot than the Schoolhouse Rock version. The Great American Melting Pot, right? It's not this kind of like cheery propaganda that he's talking about. He's totally aware of the horror of American history. He is himself a black man. And nevertheless, he says, there's something to be valued in this strange, mixed up place where we find ourselves. So, curious what you think about this, whether you liked it or not. And this is going to be on YouTube as part 2 of the close reading of The Little Man at Chehaw Station. So, find it there again, or for a while on the VOD on Twitch. But yeah, take care, and I will see you all next time we do this.